As we learned in the previous video, media query styles are applied to elements only if the media type matches the type of device displaying the site and if all the feature expressions are true. Coming up, we'll compose more detailed media queries by combining media features and using logical operators to adapt a layout to different viewport sizes. We'll then take a look at special features for mobile devices like device width and height, and a special feature for checking device pixel ratio and resolution. Let's get to it. With media queries, we're able to customize our styles to device settings with more precision than ever before. So in our new file setup here, we have a basic page layout where I've simply used divs with different colors, as we can see here, to represent each section of the page as a proof of concept. So here we have the header logo and nav, and below that is the main content section, the sidebar or secondary section, and an additional content area or extra where you might see things like ads or related links. And below that, we have the footer. Now, the widths, margins, and padding are all percentage based in the CSS. So the layout is completely fluid. And everything is laid out in one column, but we'll be adjusting this layout shortly. We can create more complex media queries with logical operators. Now, we covered the AND operator in the previous video, which can be used to combine the media type with the media feature or combine multiple media features together into a single media query. So let's talk about other logical operators we can use, like the keywords not and only. So the not operator is used to negate an entire media query. It will return true if the media query would otherwise return false. So for example, I will go ahead and use the monochrome media feature. Then inside of it, I will select the body element where I will give it a background color of red. So here we're telling the browser that if it's not on a monochrome screen, like a black and white screen, for example, then make the background color of the body red. But if the screen is monochrome, do nothing at all. So I'll refresh this. Since we're on a color display, the browser says, okay, this is true. The screen isn't monochrome, so I'll make the background red. And of course, if we then change the media feature to color, it goes back to normal because now we're telling it to change to red only if it's not on a color screen. So I'll go ahead and remove this and move on to our next example. Because next, we'll need to create a few media queries to optimize this layout for wider screens. Because currently, it's just a one-column layout that keeps growing with the screen size, which is not exactly what we want. But we do want the one-column layout only for smaller screens and devices because it stacks the content nicely and it's optimal for viewing and interacting with the content. So there's not much we really need to do for that because our base styles are already optimized for the small screen and narrow viewport widths. This is referred to as a mobile-first approach where we serve all the basic layout styles, content, and the minimal amount of code to the device by default, then gradually adjust the layout with media queries for the wider screens and devices at certain breakpoints. So for example, if some of this additional content isn't absolutely necessary for smaller screens or crucial to the mobile experience, we can initially hide the content for those screens, then reveal it as the screen gets wider. So I'll go ahead and do that for our extra content div here, since it probably won't be the most important content on the page. Now, there are different ways to do this, but I'll go ahead and use a display none in the extra rule. Okay, so now our initial layout styles has that extra content div hidden. So next, we'll need to add our first breakpoint. I'll just add a comment here, which notes that the layout will be for when it switches from phone to more of a tablet layout. So below this, I will add the media at rule, followed by screen, and the expression will pass. So we use the min width feature since we're working our way up from the narrow layout. So we'll make this 481. When it gets wider than 480, we'll want to use that extra space that opens up to float our columns. So I will first select the call divs, where I will add a float left declaration. And below that, I will select our main div, then the secondary column. We'll still keep the extra content column hidden, but we'll need to define a width for these main and secondary columns. So inside of main, I will add a width property, and I'll go ahead and add a percentage-based width. Since we're working with percentage-based values, I recommend that you include the full percentage value, even though they might seem really long. But this way our values are as accurate as possible, especially when we're dealing with page layout. It's very important. So I will do the same for our secondary container. I will add a width property and a percentage-based width value of 31.9148936 and so forth. And below that, I will add a margin left property, and I will also give this a percentage value. That way it's completely fluid. So we'll go ahead and save this, then refresh the browser, and let's take a look. So now when the viewport width is greater than 480 pixels, we see how it shifts to the new layout we just defined in the media query, and everything else remains fluid. So there is one more logical operator we need to cover, the only operator, which is used to apply the styles only if the entire query matches. The only operator is useful for preventing older browsers that do not support media queries from applying the given styles. Otherwise, any styles we place in a media query will automatically apply to the page all at once because the older browser doesn't recognize or support the media features. So if an older browser sees the media at rule, then sees the operator only, and doesn't recognize it as a specifier, the browser stops from applying any of the styles inside the media query. Now, the browsers that support media query will simply ignore the only keyword, and the styles in the media query are then applied as they should be, according to the conditions we set. So it's optional, we don't have to use it, but it is recommended if you need to support older browsers like IE8. So we'll go ahead and keep it in our example. Next, let's create another media query here that will optimize the layout for larger screen sizes. So again, I'll simply add a comment that just says tablet to desktop because it's for when the layout switches from a tablet to a wider desktop layout. So I will add media only screen, and the expression will need to pass. I'll once again use the min width feature and the value 769 pixels. Since our header will be much wider, we'll need to float the logo and the nav. So we'll select our logo. We will give it a float property, and we will float it left. We'll then select the main nav, where we'll also give it a float property, but this time we will float it right. Now, in this wider layout, we want to show that extra content div. So we'll simply select the extra div and display it block. We'll also need to select our main content div, and we'll reduce the width just to make some room for the extra div. So I'll just adjust the size to about 40.4255%. And finally, I will apply a width to the extra column. Then a margin left property and its flexible percentage value. So we're accommodating things nicely by adding a smaller width to main, then a flexible margin and width to our extra container. I noticed that we're repeating some code here in the margin value, which I always try to avoid. Notice how the secondary and extra selectors have the same margin left value. So let's go ahead and adjust this. I'll remove it from our second media query here, and we'll go up to this first media query and combine them into one selector. This way, we'll only need to declare the margin left value once, but it will still carry over to the next media query. So I'll select secondary and extra, and I will give it the margin left declaration, and I'll remove this top one here. Okay, so we'll go ahead and save this and view it in the browser. We'll refresh, and now we can see that when our viewport is 769 pixels or wider, it switches to that nice 3-column layout. And there we again see our extra content div, and we see the logo floated left, and the nav is floated over to the right, and our column margins look good. Finally, let's add one more media query that will keep our layout at a fixed width once the viewport starts to get too wide. Otherwise, it'll just keep expanding as it increases in width, which is unnecessary. So in our CSS, we will go ahead and create a new media query breakpoint. And we'll make the breakpoint at a min width of 1024 pixels. We'll select wrap, and we will give it a fixed pixel width of 980 pixels. Okay, so we'll save this. We'll refresh it. And now we can see how our layout stays fixed at 980 pixels once the viewport is greater than or equal to 1024 pixels.